Chapter 3, Lily Evans' Not So Very Good Day. Lily squinted her eyes at her plate of breakfast and tried her best to ignore the tiredness that was weighing her down with an actual physical presence. Indeed, she'd checked that little weights hadn't attached themselves to her person. The cause of this fatigue was happily buttering some toast and humming a wizarding song under her breath. Alice seemed to be in a frightfully good mood despite the fact that she had been up past 3 in the morning, and keeping her friend awake as well, chattering on about all things Frank Longbottom. Lily liked the reserved 7th-year boy as much as one could like a best friend's boyfriend, but even she had her limit when it came to hearing about his health, his parents, and Alice could overshare when it came to some personal aspects of her and Frank's relationship. Still, as Lily took a big gulp of hot tea, she resolved herself to be happy for her friend. Better having Alice back to the way she was than the ghost-like spectre who had haunted the Gryffindor Tower for the few days before Frank woke up. "I do hope he comes back today," Alice started saying. "The healers said he might be able to, but they weren't certain. And Frank always says his mother is a little overprotective." Lily gradually tuned her out. They had discussed it all the previous evening. She nodded at the right points while struggling to drink enough tea to remain awake for the day. She was on her second cup when a tawny owl dropped down with a Daily Prophet clutched in its talons. The bird eyed her suspiciously as she fumbled for the few canutes the paper cost, finally finding them tucked into a corner of her bag. The bird flew off, cuffing her on the head with a wing as it did so, and she grumbled that it hadn't been that much of a weight. With a sigh, she opened the small weekday edition and hoped for a little better coverage of the Hogsmeade attack. Not that she was the gossipy sort like some, just that the previous reports had seemed more fiction than fact, and Lily was starting to worry that no one would ever know exactly what had happened. She herself wanted a few holes filled in. The time between returning to the pub, after trying to fend off Dementors, and leaving the boarded establishment, when Dumbledore arrived, was a little confusing. She felt an odd desire to rationalize what had happened, as if then and only then could she put it out of her mind and get on with the business of living. An odd phrase, that. She'd never really understood it before now. What other business could one be in? Lily cast a cautious glance at her best friend. It was wrong of her to blame Alice for keeping her awake. Even without the blonde's distraction, her nights had not been restful. She glanced at the rolled-up paper and at least the headline did not disappoint. Hogsmeade hero receives honors. Lily leaned closer, unfolding the paper curiously. There were several heroes that came to her mind. Professor Barton, whose current status was a question of dispute, certainly deserved the honor. He'd driven back the Dementors, and gossips claimed that he had dueled Voldemort himself, which also explained the rumors of his death. Then there were all the Aurors who had died defending the village. Lily had been in the Three Broomsticks when the Death Eater's plans had come to fruition. So many young men and women. How many families had lost brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers? If anyone, they deserved all the honor that could be bestowed. Although heaping honor on corpses did feel a little hollow. Or perhaps even Frank or the others like him who had stepped forward to defend the town even when they had no obligation to. They had risked their lives to protect people while so many others had hidden away. Lily felt ashamed that in many ways, she was among those who had stayed at a safe distance. It had been easy to rationalize at the time. After all, she was just a student. What help could she have been? But in times afterward, her reasons seemed more like weak excuses. She examined the page closely, her eyes immediately drawn to the picture that crowded the page. The image showed a very exuberant man in raw robes, and next to him, shaking the older man's hand, was a face that was disturbingly familiar. Lily's eyes narrowed and a frown marred her features as she pulled the newspaper closer and began reading the story that accompanied the baffling photograph. Hogsmeade hero receives honors. Yesterday the reluctant hero of Hogsmeade had finally been identified as James Potter, 6th-year Gryffindor at Hogwarts. In a startling demonstration of power, young James Potter managed to keep you-know-who at bay until reinforcements arrived. He was really something, said Samuel Horton, of the Charms Modifiers Union. He protected the other students and used a pretty powerful spell-freezing charm, Isimus perhaps, to disrupt the Fierius Serpentis. That's a level 11 spell. He saved my daughter and my life, said Annabelle Edwards, a house witch. We were pinned and I got hit with a terrible curse. I don't think we would have made it if he hadn't saved us. I only hope I can thank him. However, after the daring heroics, the 6th-year student quickly became a figure of mystery, not even taking credit for his deeds. Despite that, with the testimony of several witnesses, and the help of the herbology professor at Hogwarts, he was properly identified and honored by the Aurora Division of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. We, members of the press, then learned that it was his modesty alone that left him so mysterious. When confronted with his accomplishment, the humble Potter still maintained he had merely shot off a few curses. Bravery personified, the best example of young men today, declared spokes Wizard Aurora Filibuster during a press conference at Hogwarts. It's every good Englishman's duty to stand against this criminal, this villain of the wizarding world, Potter responded when asked about his frame of mind, and any concern for his own safety during the attack. You all know how his father earned an Order of Merlin 3rd class for his action against Grindelwald. And the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Young James here stepped in and saved a lot of lives, and we, the wizarding world, should all be thankful. There is even some speculation that Potter may earn an Order of Merlin himself, which would make him one of the youngest individuals ever to receive such an honored award. As for his future, the Aurora Division has extended an open invitation to the young man once he graduates from Hogwarts. We'll have a spot for someone like him. Filibuster claimed. Lily Evans couldn't read anymore, her Vison had started to turn red. James Potter. James Potter, a hero. James Potter, brave. Maybe some of those she could be convinced of. He was a Gryffindor, after all, and they weren't the house known for cowardice. And he certainly tried to act like the hero enough. It wouldn't be impossible for him to luck into actually playing the role. Out of pure chance, mind you. But James Potter, modest, humble, impossible. They had to have the wrong person. James Potter was as arrogant as they came. He was pretentious and even had the capacity for cruelty. She'd witnessed it herself. She glanced around at the muttered comments that were emerging throughout the hall. Those without newspapers were grappling with their neighbors as people everywhere began reading the Daily Prophet with rapt attention. Heads looked around excitedly, searching the Gryffindor table with probing eyes, but the subject of their search seemed to be missing. Lily was actually a little surprised. She expected to see the preening peacock all smiles, probably offering people autographs. She could just picture it. That stupid smile on his stupid face. Just the thought made her want to roll up her newspaper and whack him over the head with it. Just who did he think he was? How dare he take away the credit from the real heroes? And now that he had muddied the water, who knew if they would ever discover what had happened that day in Hogsmeade? Lily. You okay, Lils? Lily looked up suddenly, her green eyes meeting Alice's. Her friend flinched from the righteous fury in her eyes. Your paper is on fire. Lily looked at the parchment in surprise. Indeed, the edges were charred and small flames licked the corners hungrily. She quickly dunked the paper into a jug of pumpkin juice, emitting some squealed protests from her neighbors. Lily took a breath. It had been years since she'd had any uncontrolled bursts of magic. She pulled the sodden newspaper from the jug, glaring at the picture of James Potter that had somehow survived her little fit of pyromania. What is it? Alice asked. Her own thoughts about Frank seemed to have taken a quick detour. I'm going to class, Lily fumed, rising to her feet and walking almost predatorily out of the great hall. Alice took a moment to observe the burned and stained paper, her eyebrows raising at the picture, before she dashed after her friend. What class did they have? Frank. Alice exclaimed in surprise just as she reached the doors. Alice, Frank said with a grin, taking in her surprised expression and flushed features. Alice threw herself at her boyfriend, her arms wrapping around his waist and holding him tight, not caring in the slightest that some of the other students had broken into giggles and were pointing in their direction. Frank, she said into his chest. She could feel his heart beating. Alice released a sigh. Just this once, Lily's feud with James was going to have to wait. Lily made it all the way to the defense classroom before she remembered that they didn't have defense. Barton was still dead, or in St. Mungo's, depending on whom you talked to, and as such their classes had been temporarily postponed. She threw her bag on the floor across from the classroom's door and began pacing the currently empty hallway in a fit of temper. James Potter had done some low things, but this. And to think she had almost thought he was growing up. She'd stood with him and Barton against the Dementors, and part of her had been entirely unprepared by the selfless loyalty he had shown for his friend. She'd like to think that she would have done the same, but it was easier standing behind him somehow. Lily crossed her arms and stared at the floor as if it had offended her gravely. but then to try and take credit for fighting Voldemort. She fumed aloud. She suddenly decided to kick the wall viciously and yelped, hopping on one leg as she drew her now injured foot up for examination. She slowly hobbled to the wall and sat next to her bag. She tucked her foot up and rubbed it more roughly than was needed. That was very stupid of her. Now not only was she tired and angry, but lame as well. She folded her knees under her skirt and wrapped her robe around her moodily. She sat like that for a number of minutes, the time seeping by both slow and fast, staring angrily at the wall. Perhaps after such a beginning, Lily should have known that this was one of those days where it was better to simply turn right around and go back to bed. But she was too much of a serious student to purposefully miss class, and she wasn't about to let James Potter be the cause behind ruining her perfect attendance. And perhaps a part of it was out of spite. Merlin helped James Potter when she stumbled upon him. He was going to get a serious tongue lashing. Dignity be damned, she would call him out before the entire Hogwarts population if need be. Actually, that seemed like a very good idea, and was perhaps the reason why she was inspecting the Gryffindor table so closely when it came time for lunch. Well, that was a fascinating lecture, Alice said in an attempt at distraction. Who would have guessed that coloring charms could be so useful? I, for one, just realized the vast potential my wardrobe now holds. Lily didn't respond. The wrinkle on her forehead, that had developed over the day, crinkled even more deeply as her search for James Potter proved in vain, or that Professor Flitwick used to earn a living stripping. Don't get me wrong. He probably cut a fine figure in his younger years. That was just like James Potter to skip school, and the one time that she wanted to find him. Every other day he'd find her and be an annoyance, but the one day she was looking for him, he seemed to have vanished. And he still has the moves. Imagine how acrobatic someone of his stature can be. I didn't think men could even do the splits. Not to mention being in a leopard thong at the time. James Potter had better pray to whatever gods he believed in that she found him soon. What? Lily said, shooting her friend a bewildered glance. Somehow the words, leopard thong, had invaded her mind and meshed very uncomfortably with the other subject of her focus. James Potter. Would you get out of this mood you've been in? Alice said, rolling her eyes and linking arms with her best friend. So James Potter is getting all the credit. Does it really matter? At least people are looking cheerful again. For the past few days, everyone has been on the verge of a nervous wreck. That's not the point, Lily griped sullenly. The pair settled at the Gryffindor table and examined the usual lunch fare. Lily grabbed a sandwich and tore at the crust irritably. What is the point then? Alice demanded. There are probably worse people that the papers could pick. Worse people? Lily exclaimed. She spluttered, unable to explain Alice's lackadaisical attitude. Yes, worse people. And look, he isn't here making a show of himself, is he? Lily had to admit, Alice was making a point there. A surprising point. And how do you know that he didn't save those people? Why would they lie, anyway? Lily bit her lip as she composed a good excuse. It just can't be true. She finally decided. How do you know? Alice pressed. You weren't there. Maybe he did save everyone. Lily paused. I'm willing to believe that maybe, just maybe, mind you, he might have helped a few people. But, Alice rolled her eyes, even if he did help a few people, what makes him the hero of Hogsmeade? Plenty of other people helped just as much as he could have. What about Frank? Doesn't he deserve some credit? He fought Death Eaters, too. Alice chuckled. Frank would love that, she stated, her voice laden with sarcasm. You know what I mean, Lily said with a shrug. I know you're unreasonable, Alice argued back. I am not unreasonable, Lily said. She crossed her arms and stared at her uneaten sandwich. She was pouting, which was also annoying and immature, but she couldn't seem to break out of the posture. When it comes to James Potter, you've been trying to find a reason to hate him since third year when he turned your hair green. Lily frowned. And why shouldn't I? She demanded. Alice sighed. Because James Potter is not 13 anymore and neither are you. Because people change, because maybe some people learn to look past the transgressions from childhood. Alice took a bite of her own sandwich and raised an eyebrow at her suddenly quiet friend. But he hasn't changed, Lily concluded. And neither have you, Alice said with a grin. She slung an arm around her friend's shoulder. Don't misunderstand. I like you just the way you are. Really, your determination to hate him is kind of adorable. Lily took a drink of pumpkin juice to hide her scowl. Alice had lost her mind. James Potter hadn't changed. He might be taller, but otherwise he was same 13-year-old boy who stole her quills and tried to copy her homework assignments, and she was not unreasonable. Better snag James while you can, Hortense called to Lily as she passed. He's going to have plenty of beautiful witches after him now. Lily fumed. Alice laughed. You're just too funny. I'm going to class. For the second time that day Lily left her table, leaving her meal half finished, and stormed through the great hall. This time, tripping on her own robes and just barely making it out without falling on her face. It was karmic, she decided. She'd done this too often today and vowed never to storm out of a room again, if only to remain original. By the end of the day, it was officially the worst day Lily could recall ever having. She had forgotten her homework for Transfiguration, dozed off in potions, earning herself a reprimand from Slughorn, something he had never done before, and just as she was returning from the library, after a serious study session, her bag had split open, splattering ink all over her books and homework, not to mention leaving black splotches on her new leather shoes. There was probably nothing else that could make it worse, but she wasn't going to tempt fate. She vowed to simply go to her room and go to sleep. The common room was abuzz with people chattering over James Potter's triumph, but she bit her lip and not an utterance of dissent left her lips. She practically crawled to the girls' staircase, pushed the door to her dorm room open and, fully clothed, dropped into her bed and closed the curtains. As she shut her tired eyes, she couldn't help but hope that this wretched day had all been one terrible dream. Later, she would find that horribly ironic. Lily's green eyes bust open and she bit back the muttered curse that had been on the tip of her tongue. The dream had been too convoluted to understand, a smattering of vague worries and fears. It hadn't made sense, because in the dream she was worried over someone like James Potter. Like, as in the sense that while the person looked like James Potter, he didn't incite the same ire that usually coursed through her when James was present. Instead, she felt concerned, worried, even, and when she'd been close to him, she'd known it wasn't James Potter at all, but another boy. Lily rubbed her forehead and tried to think back to a book on dream symbolism she had read. She'd been 13 and terribly interested in that sort of topic at the time, but she couldn't for the life of her remember the specifics now, and the more she thought about the dream, the more the details fled from her, and the less important they seemed to become. She raised a hand and tugged at the rumpled school uniform she had fallen asleep in. The skirt had bunched up and the clasp around her waist had dug into her skin, leaving a red impression. She'd had the wherewithal to remove her tie, but the buttoned shirt now felt too tight at the shoulders. She pushed open her curtains intending to change into her pajamas and perhaps do some reading, but found herself a little surprised at the dark dorm room. She hadn't thought she'd been asleep that long, but the steady breathing of her dorm mates forced her to look at a clock. 12:10 a.m., a little past midnight, and she was wide awake. Still, she pushed herself to her wardrobe and fished around for some more comfortable clothes, finally finding what she hoped were a pair of leggings and an oversized sweatshirt that had once belonged to her father. Perhaps she'd get the rest of her homework finished, she thought. She still had a paper due for potions. Or maybe just some reading. Lily changed in the light of the bathroom, and while she gazed at her reflection in the mirror, she wondered who the tired-looking woman staring back at her was. The red hair was loose and swam around her shoulders. The face looked a little pale and her green eyes seemed to stare back at her unflinchingly. Lily wondered if this was how she looked to other people, or if maybe she'd simply not had enough sleep lately. One should never stare so critically after midnight, not after having the sort of day she'd had. Unreasonable. Alice's words from lunch came back with a sudden harshness under the bright glare of the bathroom light. Was this person in the mirror that sort of woman? Unreasonable, unbending, hard? Or was there enough vulnerability beneath that exterior to make her a human being? Lily shook her head and splashed some cold water on her face. This was definitely not the time or place to have such an introspective moment. People decided crazy things after little sleep and bad luck days. She turned off the light in the bathroom, returning to the blinding blackness of her dorm, and tripped over a few mislaid items before she finding her own satchel. She proceeded down the girls' staircase, hoping that the common room would be empty and she might have a little quiet time. Once again luck wasn't on her side. She didn't know why she even expected a break after the day she'd had. The candles were doused after midnight, but a few students remained scattered about the room using the fireplaces or charmed lights to work on homework. They were mostly 7th years, and despite the fact that school had just started, they were already looking drawn. Lily wasn't looking forward to her own newt year. There was also a small group surrounding one of the fireplaces, and the buzz of their wizarding wireless created the only noise in the room aside from the turning of pages. When Lily saw the group's occupants, she nearly turned right back around and climbed the stairs back to her dorm. Stubbornness and ill temper alone kept her stationary. What right did James Potter have to drive her away? Hadn't he already gotten enough today? Did he really have the right to deny her the ever so aptly named common room? A thought whispered that this was the perfect time to confront James about his lies, but the strict woman in the bathroom mirror haunted her and Lily shook the notion away. She could publicly denounce James Potter another time. For the moment, she just wanted to while away a few hours reading until she was tired enough to go back to bed. They were sitting at a fireplace across the room, one closer to the boys' staircase. She might as well take a seat near the one closer to the girls. They seemed too engrossed in whatever mischief they were up to. Anyway, if she ducked down a bit in her chair, there was no reason that they couldn't share the common room amicably. Huh? Take that, unreasonable. Lily nestled into a sofa and pulled out one of her potions texts to read. It was a moldy old book she'd purchased in Diagon Alley on a whim. She'd been reading it recently because it happened to contain a very good description of many common, and dangerous, interactions. She hadn't even paid the book much mind until Severus Snape's eyes had bugged over the title. If they'd still been on good terms she might have offered to let him read it. Lily heaved a sigh but shook her head and diverted her attention back to the book. Still, she wasn't spying, mind you, but despite the book's usefulness, the contents were a little dry and it was impossible not to overhear what exactly the marauders were listening to on the wireless. It was the news, oddly enough. It seemed to be one of those 24-hour news stations that aired any recent news as well as repeating the reports of the day. Lily listened closer when the radio announcer's voice stated that, coming up next, would be a partial repetition of the Minister of Magic's speech from earlier that evening. Lily shook her head, rather disappointed that her early bedtime had caused her to miss it. She turned her ear further in their direction when Minster Bagnall's voice came in. The female minister's tone was particularly grave and Lily felt a part of herself quaking with well-worn worry. There had been several such announcements as of late and each left her feeling more nervous. The audio cut in at the middle of her speech. The children of the wizarding world are precious. It is dark days when a child must be asked to stand against such violence. But it is with good heart and cheer that we recognize the effort of young Mr. Potter, and he has the ministry's thanks. He is truly a credit to his professors and I personally see him as a sign that this war, for indeed, that is what is upon us, is a war that we can win. Turn it off, James Potter stated, flopping down in a chair and running a hand through his hair. Lily ducked lower in her couch, a little startled when one of the 7th-year girls passed her to reach the dormitories. Two of the other male students were headed to their own rooms, leaving Lily alone with the marauders. Not enjoying the attention? Sirius asked, leaning toward his friend. Lily paused in her reading. That was something she'd been wondering herself. She looked around guiltily. This wasn't really snooping. Not really. She just happened to overhear. It's all bollocks, James muttered, sounding cross. Lily glanced curiously over her shoulder, a strange noise drawing her attention. She hadn't really noticed the fluctuating light, but now as she watched, she realized James Potter was tossing something into the fire. It crackled and sent up a flush of light burning quickly. Newspaper, by the look of it. Just shows you Dumbledore was right, Remus said, pointing at the wireless. Dumbledore? What does he have to do with this? Lily wondered. James grunted. Doesn't mean I have to like it. Why wouldn't this real hero step forward? Peter asked timidly. The other boys groaned, seemingly annoyed with the question. Peter muttered something too quiet for Lily to hear. If we knew why, we wouldn't have to deal with this charade. But tonight only proves his point, Remus explained. Yeah, people looked happy, eh? Sirius said. He seemed oddly serious, and thoughtful, which was enough for Lily to start wondering if this was actually a dream and she'd never really awoken up. She pinched herself just to be certain. James just kept tossing newspaper into the fireplace, not saying a word. As the silence dragged on, the other members of the mischief-making club said their goodnights and moved upstairs, leaving James alone with his thoughts. Lily couldn't help but watch him. She could only see his profile, and with the flickering light, she could barely make out that. But there was something different about his expression, almost as if she were looking at a different person. And somehow her anger about the lies he was telling melted, or at least dropped a few degrees. He just looked so unhappy. And what was all this about Dumbledore? She found herself still thinking about it, long after James Potter had gone to bed, and while she didn't think it then, indeed the notion never crossed her mind, it was undeniable that the tired woman in the bathroom mirror and the unhappy man by the fireplace were a perfect match. They fit together seamlessly, in a way that the children known as Lily Evans and James Potter never had. But she didn't think it then, and she finally went to sleep that night, not much wiser than she had been.